So I'm an academic and a consumer psychologist, so I spend a lot of my time trying to prove things. If not beyond a shadow of a doubt, then certainly with a 95% probability. So I'm happy today that I get to talk about my research a little more casually, sort of human to human, certainly consumer to consumer. Let me just remind you of a popular advertising campaign that really is starting and a talking point for some of this research. Remember this guy? Okay, so this guy refers to himself as a Mac, whereas this poor guy refers to himself as a PC. Now, these guys are obviously paid actors, and we don't know how they feel about any given brand, but the concept that the guy on the right refers to himself as an entire product category, personal computer, whereas the guy on the left refers to himself as a Mac, a brand, is what's really meaningful here. Okay, so today I want to talk about self-brand connections. These are connections that consumers form with brands that they think are useful in helping them either reflect or construct who they are and expressing that self-concept to others. So how do you know if you have a self-brand connection? How do we know if people have self-brand connections? Well, we ask them. Okay, so we ask them questions such as, and we're using iPhone as an example here, but you can insert any brand name. So people who are higher, who tend to have these high self-brand connections, tend to agree more with statements like, the iPhone is, I consider the iPhone to be me, or I can identify with the iPhone brand. And I can tell you, as I was originally a skeptic, that it turns out that self-brand connections are everywhere. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some results of some of my research efforts, but these results are sort of robust in the sense that we've tapped into multiple brands, from multiple consumers, across multiple purchase occasions. Trust me when I say self-brand connections are really quite ubiquitous. So there's plenty of researchers in the consumer psychology literature that have worried about or wondered about how these connections get formed in the first place. We took a different perspective. I was really concerned about what are the implications, what are the effects of these self-brand connections. And we really started in our research with a pretty simple premise. If consumers perceive themselves to be connected to brands, then brand evaluations might be tightly coupled with consumers' self-evaluations. Put differently, if the brand concept reflects the consumer's self-concept, then it's possible that the brand concept could affect the consumer's self-concept. Okay? And if that's true, then things are great when the brand performs well. But even the strongest brands falter. So we see evidence across multiple product categories, across multiple, from cars to retailers to our Pittsburgh Steelers, even to football teams, right? So we see lots of evidence that things don't always go the way we want them to go. And so the question becomes, what are the implications of that? So one of the things that we've learned in this research is that for a consumer who has a high self-brand connection, that kind of negative brand information or negative brand performance goes beyond just having kind of a cranky day at work the next day. What we actually find in this research is robust evidence that negative brand performance actually affects these consumers' self-esteem. So when we ask them questions, so when we expose them to negative brand information and then in a completely unrelated task, we ask them, how are you feeling at this moment? They tend to agree more with statements like, I feel inferior to others, and I feel like I'm not doing well. And they tend to agree less with statements like, I feel as smart as others or confident in my ability. So it seems like for these high self-brand connection consumers, brand failure is getting coded as self-failure. Now you might ask yourself, all right, well you just asked them how they felt at this moment. Does it really matter, these temporary states? And the answer is yes. Okay? What we're finding across, again, several behaviors, and I'll show a few of them to you in a second. What we're finding is that consumers are engaging in behaviors that are sometimes counterproductive and certainly counterintuitive, that are efforts to restore their positive self-concept. And sometimes those efforts include maintaining favorably high brand evaluations, sticking around, maybe when they arguably shouldn't. But there's another phenomenon that's going on, and that's that we're finding that these consumers become really much more aggressive in pursuing goals, okay? And that can be a good thing, because when we, for example, in an unrelated task, prime the concept, or we plant the seed that it's a great idea, one ought to give, what we find is that these high self-brand connection consumers who have been exposed to negative brand information tend to give more. They engage in more pro-social behaviors. They're more generous in donating their time. They're more generous in donating their money. It's a good thing. But when we take that same scenario and we expose people to, we plant that little seed that one ought to pursue one's self-interest, we see a lot of evidence that these consumers are more greedy. They take from other consumers, even in simple lab tasks. When we plant the seed that saving money is a good thing, we see that the high self-brand connection consumers who've been exposed to that negative brand information are a lot more frugal. They're a lot more fiscally responsible with their money. But when we plant the seed that one ought to pursue one's own self-worth, then they are actually a lot more financially irresponsible. So given that we're engaging in these behaviors unknowingly and unwittingly, what's a brand-loving consumer to do? And one of the things that we do know is that self-affirmation helps. So if in the middle of these tasks, between exposing these consumers to negative brand information and giving them these tasks, we ask them to pause and just think about how great they are. Or we ask them to pause and write a couple of sentences about something that they did really well as a kid. What we learned is that a lot of the effects that I've talked about disappear. Okay? So it comes back to reminding people of their own self-worth. That's one way to break this connection between the brand and the consumer. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, I'm not a person who really has these self-brand connections. I can't think of one brand about which I feel so passionately. And actually, maybe afterwards, during the coffee break, I could probably convince you that you do. But even if you didn't, I think this issue is bigger, maybe, than the people in this room. And so, for example, this is a collage. It's a Who Am I collage. It's based on some research by Lon Chaplin and Debbie Roeder-John. This was published in the Journal of Consumer Research. And this is a third graders who was asked to just use images to reflect, who am I? And we see that as young as the third grade, little girls are using brands to express, to communicate who they are. Okay? Now, I'm the mother of a 7-year-old girl, so this is not to be taken lightly from my point of view. We also see that by the time they get to the 11th grade, there's far more brands embedded in that self-concept. My goal then is to just leave you there. Okay, to give you something to think about, food for thought. My goal in coming here was to have you leave here with more questions than answers, because I think that this is the beginning of some research that has some really important implications. So I'm going to leave you there, but in the meantime, I'm going to admonish you not to lose yourself in a good brand relationship. Thank you.